And you mentioned that soccer example, I think, before, of like betting on soccer, and there are a lot of soccer things going on. I'm really curious because I think most people that listen to that don't live through hyperinflation. Like they mostly probably are in the USA, in Canada, UK, Australia, Europe, somewhere like where there's not a hyperinflation going on. Yes, inflation is still bad, even if it's 2%, 5%, but it's a very different situation if your inflation is 5% a year, or if it's 50 or 100 or even over 100% a year inflation, sometimes even 100% per month, depending on how bad of a situation you got to be in. How does the money and the inflation and the currency that you have changes human behavior? And what have you kind of seen between living through hyperinflation in Brazil versus living in America, where there was no hyperinflation? There was inflation that was high, but like not hyperinflation.
Yeah. Uh, a lot of people say, and this is a point I disagree, that like, oh, it's better to have 2 to 5 inflation than hyperinflation. I actually think it's worse, because when you have hyperinflation, it's a shock. It's a shock to your reality. You need to act. You need to do something, right? And it's a survival. If you don't do that, your money literally loses value overnight, right? I do remember, like, you can Google this. There are several stories about this. Like, my mother giving me money in the morning, saying, "Oh, here's, you're gonna buy your lunch money at your lunch at school." And she would say, "Don't bring any money back. Spend everything. Even if you have change, buy a candy, buy something, because if you bring money back, money is going to be worth less tomorrow than it was worth today, right?" And then when you live in a situation like that, you have to adapt, right? People would go. It's crazy that there are things that even today you see in Brazil that were derived from this time. So paychecks were paid on the 31st of the month. On the first of the month, the next day, you would have supermarkets packed with people. Everybody would go to the supermarket, spend their money, buy everything, like several shopping carts of foods, groceries, because they want to convert their into hard assets, which for them was food, right? Because if they waited 2, 3 days to spend that money, the capital would be worth less than it was before. So you go, here where I live in Rio, you still have these massive supermarkets around. It's a legacy of that time, that they needed to be massive, because then the first of the month, everybody would come in, would buy food, right? And then the rest of the month, the supermarkets would be empty. People are not, or would be much less packed than they were in the beginning, right? There are elements like of human, massive human psychology and damage that you see of that. And there are good things as well, right? You look at, it's worth watching the Ayrton Senna documentary on Netflix. Not the long one, the one that it's short. It's only one episode, the first one that came out. And there they show, how Senna became like this massive idol in Brazil. And in the time that he was racing, and really, winning all the races, all that. Of course, he was a phenomenal driver. But on top of all of that, Brazilians had no hope. There was nothing in the country, inside the country, that actually gave them pride to say, "I'm Brazilian." That was the first, thing that for them they could say globally, like, "Oh, I'm very proud of, something that Brazil is bringing to the globe." And when he passed away, Brazil stopped. The stock market crashed the day that he passed, right? So that's how embedded he and how important he was, I think, for Brazilian culture. And look at the videos of when he passed. Like, the country literally stopped to pay him homage for everything that he did for Brazil, and that's a reflection of the lack of hope that the people had, right? Now, this is, of course, it's a shock to the system. People need to adapt, and I think a lot of people really adapted on that. When you live in Europe, when you live in the US, where you're slowly bleeding, right? You're bleeding at 2, 5%. People don't feel, they kind of know that if they leave the money on their checking accounts, long term, it's going to be worth much less than it is, and they need to invest, need to do all these things. But it's a little bit like the frog on the boiling pan of water, right? The water is gradually getting warmer. You're not feeling it, right? You're still going to die. You're still going to get cooked. You're still going to lose all your assets, right? It's just going to take longer, but you lose the sense of urgency of actually needing to do something like that. I can guarantee you that hyper Bitcoinization would happen pretty much overnight if hyperinflation starts happening across the globe, right? Because then people have no option. They have to do this. And we've seen this. We've seen it in Argentina. We've seen it in Africa. We've seen it in Brazil, right? Where when you start to really have debasement of assets, people will flow into digital assets these days. And the biggest difference that we have today compared to where we were maybe a decade ago is that now we have an escape valve, right? Capital controls always happen in these situations, right? As I said, like in Brazil, you couldn't move your assets outside of Brazil. But now, nobody can, Bitcoin is, you don't need permission, right? To download the wallet, you can receive Bitcoin from another person. You just need an internet access. Sometimes you don't even need internet access, and you're going to get a Bitcoin transaction and you broadcast it later if you want, right? So the point is, I think, we are probably much better position now to see hyper Bitcoinization than we were in the past, but it's going to take time also because the dollar is not going to lose value. It's going to continue to be the dollar for I think we're still going to have dollar, kind of like living parallel of Bitcoin for a very long period of time. These things don't happen overnight, right? And they don't happen in all the currencies at the same time. They're going to happen here and there, here and there, here and there, and then eventually, we're going to see this.
This is a really interesting argument of hyperinflation being better than low inflation, because with hyperinflation, like there's no discussion. There is nobody saying, "Hey, everything is fine." Like if the prices go up like 2 times every month, there's no discussion of like, "Yeah, it's fine. It's just temporary. Like it's okay. It's like not that bad." If you have inflation rates of, let's say, 4% or 5% or 6% or 3%, there's a lot of people that say, "Ah, that's okay." Like you sound a little bit crazy if you say, "Oh, like it will all go to zero." Like you cannot trust those currencies. People will call you crazy because they are investing, or like they're having the money in the euro, the dollar, the yen, and it is kind of stable. Because if you look like month to month, they're like, "Yeah, like I can buy as many bananas as I can buy last month, and roughly the same amount of milk that I had last year," and then they are happy. But if the inflation rate is like 50 to 100% every month, or even every year, they're like, "Oh, wow, like there's no more discussion if it's bad or good. Like it's just bad in everyone's eyes, and it's a shock to the system, and then you have to do something against that." That's a really, really interesting point.
We also normalize the fact that people normalize the fact that 2%, even 2% inflation is okay, right? Say, "Oh, it's okay. That's expected." It's actually it's worse than that. We'll say it's healthy. It's very healthy to have 2% inflation, right? I mean, ethically, and if you look at the basis of monetary ethics, that makes no sense, right? Because the fact that you're getting that 2%, it's not because that there is some kind of like equal distribution happening or growth or whatever. It's not. It's just because of money printing. Somebody somewhere just pressed to inflated your base by 2%, right? With a push of a button, where the other 98, 100%, right, depending how you look at it, had to work hard to get that, had to actually, sweat to get the fruits of their labor converted into monetary assets, right? I don't have a money printer at home, right, like the central bank, but I can print 2% a year, right? And then even if even if you put the case of, yeah, but you need 2% because the 2% needs to go for better distribution, governments are extremely inefficient in distributing capital, extremely. That 2% is not going to be well distributed. That 2% is going to go to those that are closer to the money printer, right? It's not going to go to the causes where it should be going. And I think the market should be doing that as well, right? We should all be engaging in charity and different things to help the market and help different people and support your communities, right? I think that's a much better system than the one that we have right now, which gets, imagine a country like the US or Brazil, where massive populations, massive concentration of capital in the hands of a federal government, right? 2% is like, you're talking about, astronomical numbers. They're in the hands of a few people to be deciding what to do, right? I can't see a world where all of that is good, right? And that's ultimately, this is why I end up always going back to, even with my financial background, right? I always go back to Bitcoin. Like, this is a much better system than the system that we have right now, right?
It's very interesting. The question of like, if inflation is not that bad, why do we need taxes then? Like, if we can just print money and like it's like, okay, if we can anyways print, and there's like, let's just print the money that we need and like erase taxes. It would be awesome for Bitcoiners because we already opted out of the currency, and then other people get inflated away. But it would be a highly unfair system for everyone that is not educated, I guess.
It's funny because like in a lot of, we're going back to real estate as we were discussing real estate, right? Particularly here in Brazil, real estate taxes are fairly high, right? And I always have this conversation. People say, "Oh, you know what? I don't like Bitcoin. You know, I prefer to own real estate." And I'm like, "Yeah, the real estate, it's not yours. You know that." They're like, "No, no, no, it's mine. I can do whatever I want." It's like, "Yeah, stop paying your taxes to see what happens, right? The government's going to come and take it from you. And how much you're paying taxes? It's like 5% a year in the property." Like, yeah, so you're renting your property, right? Yeah, that's what you're doing. You're renting your property for the government. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of your. And guess what? You die. In some countries, you actually have to pay even more taxes on that as well, right? That's also not ethical. The fact that you the work that you did for your whole life, right? Can be taxed away and will be taxed away to zero if you don't do anything to protect it, right? Uh, it's also this thing that got normalized, that taxes started as small amounts, it started growing, 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 growing. It's even worse than monetary inflation, because you have places like in the US. Like, I remember I lived in New York City. If you added all the taxes that I had with the federal, state tax, right, everything, you're getting like to 40 to 50% of taxes every year. That's insane. Where's that money going, right? You're really getting any of that money back. And why do you have to work, 50% of your time to and be a slave of the government, right? Instead of just being able to not pay that, right? So, I don't know if I'm going to live to the time of seeing, a global tax reform. But maybe, the start of a monetary reform that will lead to a global tax reform is something that, we'll start seeing at some point. But it will also take time, in my mind.
Yeah. You mean a global tax reform that is kind of everywhere the same in the world?
I think it's going to be, it's going to be driven by individuals, right? That they're going to come to the conclusion that, they can just move around. That this is happening already, right? How many people are leaving the UK? How many people are leaving the US? I mean, you tax people. Europe, I mean, you know this better than I do. It's the prime example of that, right? And that it's game theory. At some point, it takes time, because you have an emptying of talent, people leave, then you have an empty of the of the total income for the country, right? Then you have all these other places like, Dubai prospering, right? And then kind of like at some point there will be an equilibrium. Does it mean that it's going to be coordinated? No, it's just going to be, it's game theory will lead us to, I think, a place where, it's not right to tax 50% of people, right? Because the people that can leave will eventually leave, and even those that can't leave will eventually leave as well, right?
Yeah, I think also I found the Laffer curve example really interesting, where you cannot raise the taxes and expect more revenue for the state, because at some point, A, people will leave, and B, people will cheat. And we see that. I mean, Austria, I think, is a very prime example. There's a lot of black, how's it called in English, actually? There's a lot of work that isn't documented, like illegal work, however you want to
Black
call it,
market.
especially. Yeah, they are black market. Yeah, like especially in the construction industry, it's crazy how much that is the case, and it's funny because it gets discussed in politics, and they often say it's the secret backbone of Austria. If that work wasn't done and if that isn't existing, the Austrian economy might actually have a problem, and so the politics don't really even want to do something against it, because it might just break the system to a certain degree. But it's always a funny thing when I hear like socialists saying like, "Oh, we should just like increase taxes because then we have more money in the state and we have more prosperity in the country." I'm like, that is so wrong on so many different angles.
Exactly. And it's also, the premise is that the people who are going to get this capital are actually going to allocate the capital well, which that it's already broken, right? We know that's a fact, right? Governments do not allocate capital well. So, even if they did, just taking away from one person to give to another, it's robbery, right? That's the definition of robbery, right? And it's crazy, man, because it's like inflation. It got normalized, it got accepted, right? The same thing that people say about a 2% inflation is needed, otherwise the economy is going to collapse, right? They say, a 40% tax is needed because otherwise the economy will collapse. When both of these are completely wrong, the world would be a much better place if it had no inflation and very low taxes or no taxes, right? But to get there, I don't know. There are good ways to get there. There are bad ways to get there, right? I don't know how we're gonna get there, but eventually, I think it's unavoidable. And I think currencies like Bitcoin and just thinking about just as a currency now, it's an escape valve, right? That people can just exit at any time, and just like they can pack their things from the UK and move to to another country, they can get their currency and put it in a wallet and move it to anywhere that they want, which is something that people didn't have in the past, right? And I think this mobility will lead to the mobility of capital, the labor of people, will lead to to this. We call it a tax reform. When you say reform, you think about it's kind of like, as you said, coordinated. I don't think it's going to be coordinated. It's just going to be a beautiful act of the market, right?
The first thing that every Bitcoiner does, and the most important activity that every Bitcoiner keeps on doing, is buying Bitcoin. And I personally use Relay to buy and sometimes also spend or sell my Bitcoin. And there are two main reasons why I do so. The first one is it's Bitcoin only. They do not do any shit coins. They do not do any cryptos, any stocks, or anything else. This is a tool, an app that is fully focused only and solely on Bitcoin. The second one is self-custody. They give you the keys to your Bitcoin the moment you buy them. You never give them the control over your Bitcoin, and you don't have to trust them because you can verify that you and only you have the keys to your Bitcoin. There's no third-party risk. There's no freezing of your assets. There's no rug pulling. There's nothing of that. Download Relay, the app, on your phone, or go to relay.app on your browser and use code Robin to save fees and get cheaper Bitcoin. I want to tell you about something very special to me. It's called micro-seed. If you hold your Bitcoin in self-custody, and you should, you know how critical it is to secure your seed phrase. You should not have them on paper. You should not have them on anything else than titanium. With micro-seed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups because microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today, and you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io.